Let's start by digging into Marcion of Sinope, born around 85 CE in Sinope, which is a port city by the Black Sea. His background was pretty fascinating, given his father was a bishop and he grew up in a Christian setting. But his later teachings really shook things up.
Right, it's intriguing how someone nurtured in that environment could take such a radically different stance later on. What struck you most about his early life?
Well, his financial success as a ship owner really set the stage. He had the means to travel widely and eventually landed in Rome around 140 CE. He even made a huge donation, 200,000 sesterces, though what he brought intellectually was far more disruptive.
That donation is like a huge sum and must have sure given him a platform, but it's ironic that his wealth couldn't buy him acceptance of his views in Rome, right?
Exactly. His money wasn't enough to override the radical theological ideas he introduced. Remember, Rome at that time was not the monolithic church we think of today. It was a loose federation of house churches filled with debates over doctrine and scripture.
And there was no fixed New Testament canon yet, correct? Just a lot of competing ideas about who Jesus really was and what the scriptures meant.
Yes, totally. Without a universally accepted canon, every theological challenge could push the boundaries further. Marcion's ideas were especially disruptive given that climate.
So what were the main points of his theology? I recall that his views on the Old Testament were pretty radical.
Right. His radical idea was a split between the God of the Old Testament and the God revealed by Jesus. He argued that the former was a legalistic, wrathful creator of the flawed material world, while the latter was, loving and merciful. It's like he was rewriting the very definitions of divinity.
That's such a bold, almost jarring dichotomy. So he effectively condemned the Hebrew scriptures as irrelevant to the salvation offered by Christ?
Absolutely. In his view, Jesus wasn't even the Messiah foretold in Jewish prophecy. He promoted this idea that the true Jesus had no physical body at all, more like an illusion. It's a stance that we'd call docetism.
Docetism, yes, that challenges the very idea of incarnation. So his entire theology was built on redefining this relationship between the old and the new, right?
Exactly. And then there's his canon. Around 144 CE, he published what some call the first attempt at a New Testament. He created a version of the Gospel of Luke that was heavily edited to remove anything that tied Jesus to Jewish traditions.
He also put together 10 of Paul's letters, right? And he edited those too?
Yeah, correct. He included Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Romans, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, which he renamed Laodiceans, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon.
Yep.
Each of these texts was stripped of parts that he considered Judaizing. Essentially, he was trying to purify Christian scripture by jettisoning what he saw as extraneous.
I find that fascinating, but also a bit problematic. I mean, it seems a little extreme to entirely reject the Old Testament component. Don't you think there's a risk of oversimplifying early Christian identity?
That's a good point, and I respect that critique. It's worth mentioning that many later scholars see Marcion as both a heretic and a serious theologian. He certainly forced the early church to clarify what was truly Christian.
Exactly.
His extreme positions inadvertently pushed the boundaries of orthodox belief.
So you could say that his heresy was a catalyst for unity, in a way, by forcing the church to define its canon?
Definitely. His challenge led to the eventual establishment of the fourfold gospel canon, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and solidified the framework of what became the New Testament. It's like his radical moves paved the way for a more cohesive Christian identity.
And what about the Roman Christian leadership at the time? I understand figures like Pope Hyginus and Pope Pius I were pivotal during Marcion's era.
Yes, exactly. Pope Hyginus, who was around during Marcion's arrival, and Pope Pius I, who oversaw much of the reaction to Marcion's teachings, actively resisted his radical ideas. Also, Notable figures like Justin Martyr and Polycarp called him the firstborn of Satan when they encountered him in Rome.
Yeah.
They saw him as a serious threat.
That kind of language, firstborn of Satan, is so charged. It shows just how deeply his ideas were felt as a challenge to the status quo.
True. And it also highlights the extreme polarization in early Christianity. On one hand, you had Marcion advocating for a complete break from Jewish traditions, while on the other hand, leading figures were reinforcing apostolic succession and creeds as safeguards of orthodoxy.
I wonder, given all this tension, how did Marcion manage to build his own following?
Well, his appeal was really tied to his radical clarity. He founded what became known as the Marcionite Church, which spread across the Roman Empire, stretching to Syria, Egypt, and even North Africa. His network had a structured hierarchy with bishops and congregations.
Yep. So his ideas weren't just confined to Rome. They resonated across a large geographic area.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. Despite being excommunicated and having his donation returned, his influence lasted centuries. The Marcionite Church even persisted well into the eastern provinces, possibly until the 5th century or beyond.
Mm-hmm. That kind of longevity definitely underscores how compelling, even if controversial, his theology was.
Yes, indeed. And modern scholars increasingly view Marcion as more than just a heretic. Figures like Marcus Vincent and Jason Badun see him as the first systematic Christian theologian, arguing that his gospel might have even influenced the canonical texts we have now. It's like his radical editing forced everyone else to define what was acceptable.
That really is a twist of historical irony. Marcion, seen as a villain in his time, might actually be the reason we have the New Testament as we know it today.
Exactly. Without his challenge, the debate over what constituted true Christianity might have taken a completely different route. In fact, some argue that even the Gospel of Luke and Acts could have been formulated in direct response to his edited versions. It's like a feedback loop shaping doctrine.
I can see that. It's almost as if his threat compelled early church leaders to build a more robust canon to safeguard their beliefs.
Right. It was a defensive move that, ironically, ended up reinforcing church orthodoxy. And if you think about it, his radical dismantling of Jewish influences forced the proto-Orthodox Church to establish clearer boundaries and a set of creeds that are still relevant today.
Yeah, exactly. So, would you say that Marcion's legacy is more about sparking necessary reforms than just being divisive?
I'd say so. While he's been branded a heretic, his ideas undeniably pushed early Christians to define their identity more clearly. It's like, yeah, he was a rebel, but his challenge acted as a catalyst for much-needed reform in Scripture and doctrine.
That makes sense. And it goes to show that even controversial figures can have a lasting, even positive, influence on the evolution of thought.
Exactly. You see, Marcion's questioning about the relationship between the Old and New Testaments and the nature of God still resonates. His work forced the early church to ask, what really defines us? And eventually, that led to the establishment of the 27-book New Testament.
It's fascinating to think his legacy lives on in ways we might not always recognize at first glance. Even today, debates on scriptural interpretation subtly echo Marcion's impact.
Absolutely. And while some might critique his approach for being too extreme, we can't ignore that without his radical questioning. The boundaries of early Christianity might have remained fluid and undefined.
Exactly. So, in the end, whether we see him as a heretic or a visionary, there's no denying that Marcion of Sinope reshaped the early church. His legacy challenges us to always re-examine our assumptions about tradition and authority.
Right on. His life and work remind us that questioning the status quo, even in controversial ways, can sometimes lead to lasting change. It's a powerful lesson in history and theology.